Good morning. Welcome to the Korea Society. Welcome to Studio Korea. We're delighted to have you here in the small studio audience tonight today. And we are very privileged to have with us one of the thought leaders in the areas of foreign policy, and that is Professor Park Chin. Dr. Park Chin has been a singular force in thinking creatively about Korea and its place in the world for well over 3 decades. His biography is rich. He began here in Boston back in the early 80s. He has held very key posts both in policy and advisory, and he is the chair professor at Hankook University of Foreign Studies. He has just been at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and I will ask him a bit later about his experience here. And he is somebody who can speak very authoritatively, I think, too, about academic cooperation and the exchange of ideas between the United States and Korea as well. So we'll end on that note. But what I'd like to begin with is the topic that brought all of you here today, and which he is probably unmatched among many analysts to speak on, which is that of regional relations. And certainly in the last half decade, we have seen a fundamental shift in the relations among Korea, Japan, and China. And it certainly has been worrisome in terms of the dynamic between Korea and Japan, and perhaps even more worrisome from a broader strategic view in terms of China's relations with Japan and the step up of tension over territorial and historical issues. So, welcome. We're delighted to have you back as an old friend of the Korea Society. And I'm wondering if you had a few initial thoughts about the regional scene and how we here should weigh that in doing our analysis.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. It is my always great pleasure and honor to be here at the Korea Society. I almost feel like I'm a family of
Indeed,
the
you are.
society now. I'm now visiting the United States to conduct research and also interviews with the friends whom I know who are also looking into Korea-U.S. relations and also Northeast Asia. It looks like you have a great weather in New York now. I mean, the August is supposed to be a very hot season and also holiday season, but I'm very grateful to all of you who are here to share your views on the subject that we are going to discuss. And thank you, Stephen, for your hospitality. I was here in March, but again in August. I may be here again sometime this year.
With our good luck.
Because a lot of things are happening in Northeast Asia, and I think we need to kind of keep ourselves updated on what's happening and what can be done. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current situation of cooperation and conflicts in Northeast Asia, especially among three countries, Korea, China, and Japan. And also touch upon the roles the United States as a good friend of South Korea and Japan, and as a strategic partner of China. What can the United States do to improve the situation in the area? As you all know very well, the volume of trade and the size of the GDPs and the size of the population of three countries in Northeast Asia, Korea, China, and Japan, are more than 20% of the global total GDPs and the global total trade volumes. Especially in recent years, the intra-regional trade among three countries have grown rapidly to the extent that to China, the rising economic and political power, geopolitical power in the region, the trade with South Korea and Japan are becoming bigger than its trade with European Union and America. So this means that we have a growing intra-regional economic interdependence among the three countries, which will continue to grow in the future. China is the second largest economy in the world. In terms of the export, China is already regarded as the biggest economic power already. Japan is the third largest economic power. So the region has a great potential to be developed in the future. The South Korean economy has been also continuing to grow, although in recent years the growth rate has kind of slowed down. We try to recover our economic growth potential. All three countries are members of the G20, the forum to manage global economy and to prevent any crisis that we have seen in the past and to move towards more safe financial community in the area. We do, however, are faced with various issues of conflict and frictions. Most of all, the history issue, the past history. We still have to find a common perspective on the common history that all three countries have gone through: the wars, the colonialism, and also the political developments in three countries have been so intertwined with each other that we need to have a common interpretation of the history that we have gone through. Second is a territorial dispute. We live so close by. Therefore, we have had overlapping territorial claims over especially the maritime area, the islands issue, especially between Korea and Japan, between Korea and China, and between China and Japan. And then the issue of nationalism. The countries in the area have had a complicated history of mutual rivalry in the case of Japan and China, and also transformation from a colony into an independent country in the case of South Korea, and now China as a growing geopolitical power in the world certainly express their own signs of nationalism in the area. And this could, on the one hand, work for the interest of the country. It could be a driving force behind the economic development and growth, but on the other hand, could create frictions and conflicts among the three countries. And then, of course, the biggest concern that we see emerging in the region is a growing sense of rivalry between China and Japan. Korea is right in between these two countries. We have no escape from the China-Sino-Japan relationship. So obviously from the Korean viewpoint, we want to see a more favorable and harmonious relations between China and Japan. So Korea's position is that we want to maintain and want to develop our balanced, pragmatic diplomacy between China and Japan. China is the largest trade partner of South Korea already. The trade volume is greater than our trade with US and Japan combined. President Xi Jinping visited Seoul recently to discuss a common agenda, how to deal with North Korea, and how to develop our economy together in the form of the FTA, the Free Trade Agreement between China and South Korea, and also how to deal with our past history. With Japan, we share democracy and free markets, and we are common allies of the United States. So traditionally, we have had a triangular cooperation among South Korea, US, and Japan, which still is continuing. But in recent years, because of the rise of China, because of our difficulties of dealing with North Korea, because of China-Japan rivalry, and particularly because of the tension between South Korea and Japan, the momentum of this trilateral cooperation has been weakened to a certain extent. And it is the task of South Korea and Japan to see how we can recover this productive cooperation among the three countries, South Korea, Japan, and the United States. Meanwhile, we maintain a strong alliance with the United States. The United States is the only ally that South Korea has. We have U.S. troops being stationed in South Korea to keep peace and freedom of the country, to defend and deter North Korean security threats. And therefore, this alliance should continue long time in the future. We have had 6 decades of the alliance. We have had ups and downs, but it has thrived. It is an effective, resilient, and flourishing relationship that we are very proud of. The third one is a triangular cooperation among 3 countries, South Korea, China, and Japan. We have had discussions on how to introduce the trilateral FTAs among the 3 countries. Despite the differences of the levels of economic development, and despite the different focus on the national economic strategy, we think that somehow this region should develop into a more closely intertwined, interdependent community. And we see the case of the European Union to be able to create a common economic community with a single currency and a single foreign policy. We haven't reached that level yet in Asia. For us, it's a long way to go. But I think that, for example, if Britain, France, and Germany, after the 2 bloody world wars, could sit down and come to terms with each other on the past history and create a European community, why can't Korea, China, Japan do a similar thing? So the good start is in FTA. But right now, this trilateral FTA is now faced with the challenges. One is the political relationship among the 3 countries. As I mentioned, history issues and the territorial issues as well. So these are, in a way, stumbling blocks for making progress on the FTAs. And 3 countries certainly see each other as a complementary economic partner. The different levels of economic development could also create a good synergy among 3 economies to create a more complementary economic interdependence. But now we have 2 different emerging multilateral free trade networks. One is in the East Asia, one is in the Asia Pacific. One is called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, where China, Korea, Japan are all working as members. But then we have the TPP, as you all know, the Trans-Pacific Partnership with US and Japan as leading members for the conclusion of the 12-country Asia-Pacific free trade. So Japan is now currently focusing on TPP. Korea is now focusing on Korea-China bilateral FTAs. So that means that trilateral FTA process has been kind of delayed for some time. But I think that eventually it'll happen because without the trilateral FTA, how can we accomplish the regional comprehensive economic partnership where all 3 countries are members? And one more point is that there's a view that this East Asian Free Trade Network, ALCEP, on the one hand, and the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, on the other, are kind of a counterbalancing or mutually exclusive trade blocs. I don't think it is the case. We already have a quite substantial interaction, intra-regional economic transactions going on. Therefore, eventually, in my view, it's my personal view, that these 2 economic blocs will emerge as one big Asia-Pacific free trade network, which means that China should make its mind its own mind about what to do with TPP. South Korea has already expressed our willingness to join the TPP, but now the negotiations on the rulemaking are going on, so we'll wait for some time to join this bloc officially. But China currently, as I mentioned, is negotiating with South Korea. From our viewpoint, it is a good opportunity to help liberalize the China market, the biggest market in Asia, to accept global standards and to move towards a more internationally open Chinese market, so that eventually when China decides to join the TPP, it's China's decision, of course, then it'll be very instrumental in creating the bigger Asia-Pacific FTA. So in a way, South Korea is acting as a kind of a tugboat in pushing to create the bigger free trade network in the Asia-Pacific.
It's a great analogy, and we're just off the East River here, so that's one that means something to this crowd.
Yes.
If I can perhaps push you on a few of these points with some of the dichotomy out there in the arguments and see if we can't get your opinion. You present a very good argument about economics and trade having a pull or a push effect by way of getting us out of this morass that's political and that is seeing things like nationalism and issues of popular memory and history dominate. What is the process? Is the process one where the economics will supersede and there will be a political leadership decision that some of these other issues need to be placed more in perspective or in the background? Is it one where you see resolution of some of these differences at a political level with economics complementing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that political leadership of the countries involved certainly plays a very important role. We still haven't had a top-level meeting between the leaderships in the area. For example, President Park Geun-hye of South Korea and Prime Minister Abe of Japan still haven't had a bilateral summit meeting. For that matter, President Xi Jinping of China and also Prime Minister Abe of Japan also didn't have a chance to sit down and meet each other to discuss bilateral issues. I think that this is not working for the interest of the countries involved. Although we have difficult issues, the territorial issues or history issues, plus the nationalism factor, somehow the leaderships in this region should make efforts, concerted efforts, to create a momentum of synergy among the countries, the three countries in this case, to move towards the prosperous future. We have had the trilateral summit mechanism working for some years in this region. This certainly has to be resumed. And also we have the ASEAN +3 summit mechanism working as well. I mean, this is based upon the centrality of the ASEAN countries by inviting three countries from Northeast Asia to develop a more kind of East Asian regional political, top-level political dialogue, which is very helpful. So these issues should be seriously discussed among the political leaders. I understand that in Myanmar recently, when there was a ASEAN regional forum, there was a meeting between the foreign ministers of three countries. Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with the Chinese Foreign Minister Kishida, and also our Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se met with the Japanese Foreign Minister, and so on. After a long period of absence of such meetings. So I think that there is a kind of growing sense of urgency on the parts of the governments involved that we should not prolong this stalemate or the relationship of tension among the countries involved because the stakes are so high, and we have a lot to gain from the close partnership among the countries involved.
Do you sense that the opening of the UN General Assembly here might provide an opportunity for some sideline meetings between the heads of state?
I think so. United Nations is an international organization to pursue peace and prosperity and fight with poverty and disease and terrorism. So this is a good international forum for the leaders from many countries to get together and have a very frank discussions on the common issues and common threats involved. And it would be very desirable if the three countries can sit down together in the United Nations, maybe by the strong support of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon or the United States President, Mr. Obama, to arrange such a regional meeting among the three leaders who are present in the UN Special Summit.
Mm-hmm. Hey, last year there was a book that came out called Conversations with Ban Ki-moon by Tom Plate of the LA Times. Tom, in his interview with the Secretary General, pressed him on what he thought were the most crucial issues, and the Secretary General said that unless Korea and Japan can get it right, Northeast Asia and East Asia will not prosper. That has to be the fundamental relationship to get correctly. How do you feel, both personally and professionally, about getting that relationship back on a more mature, positive level?
Yes, I totally support the serious efforts on both sides of Japan and South Korea to sit down and talk about the differences of our views and discuss how we can close the gap between the two sides. The most important gap to close will be the historical perspectives on the Pacific War that we went through. A good example is comfort women, which is sex slaves during the militaristic period. This issue is not just an issue between Japan and South Korea, but also a universal human rights issue. The United Nations has their views on this comfort women. United States Congress has passed a resolution in 2007 about the comfort women issue and recommended an official apology by the Japanese government about the wrongdoings and atrocities in the past sufferings of the Asian women, including many Koreans. So these issues should really be seriously discussed between the two sides so that we can move towards common interpretation of history and move towards the future. Japanese government's reinvestigation of the Kona statement, which was declared in 1993 as a means of Japanese official apology and the repentance about the past wrongdoings, was a kind of a surprise to many Koreans because it is a matter of legitimacy and also credibility of the Japanese position on this issue. I think it shouldn't have studied in the first place because it gave the impression that somehow Japan is trying to make issue with the sincerity and the legitimacy of the Kono statement. But the important thing is that Japan itself has reconfirmed the contents of the Kono statement. So I think that this final conclusion, the reaffirmation of the truth contained in the Kono statement and the Japan's official apology should be maintained by the current Japanese government under Prime Minister Abe. And also there's an issue of security role, the growing security role to be played by Japan. As you all know, the Japanese cabinet has introduced collective self-defense as a means to defend its ally, the United States, when it is attacked by a third country. The logic is that Japan has to have a right to defend its ally by participating in the conflict, the military conflict. It is a new development and creates concern because the long-standing Japanese government's position is that in order to keep the commitments in the peace constitution, Japan should concentrate on its own defense, but not sending forces abroad to participate in the armed conflict outside the territory of Japan. The principles that Japan had established was that there should be legitimate and imminent active aggression against Japan, and two, there are no other means to stop the aggression, and third one, the exercise of dead rights should be limited to a minimum level necessary. Japanese government is now voluntarily changing these principles, which were long-standing, related to the interpretation of constitution. So it gives the impression that somehow Japan is going through a very difficult constitutional reinterpretation to enable Japan's growing security role in the region. Now, maybe for the United States, it'll help the U.S. interest to have Japanese support in case of the armed conflict somewhere. But to countries, the neighboring countries like South Korea, it creates concern because as long as we have these history issues and unresolved issue with Japan, the growing security role of the country certainly creates the concern that Japan is again remilitarizing itself without due attention to the national sentiments of the countries. So it is very important that United States and Japan as allies should make it very clear that in the case of collective self-defense, the exercise of this right should not in any way infringe upon the national sovereignty of the national interest of Korea, so that we can maintain a cooperative relationship among ourselves. So these concerns and this sense of distrust between the countries involved should be addressed squarely so that we can prevent any unnecessary misunderstandings or the frictions.
Mm-hmm. The timing for your prescription is good in the sense that next year is the 50th anniversary of normalization between Korea and Japan. Mm-hmm. So let's hope the political leadership listens to your call. Let me ask you about the other relationship then, and the one that's been equally, if not more, in the news of late, given the visit this summer by Xi Jinping to Seoul to meet with Park Geun-hye. The basic reading in the Western press was very successful meeting, interesting development. The reality is very much that of a cynic world. The economics are good. The financial press here in New York did a pretty good job of covering the business aspects of it, and they were significant on the film level, on some of the technology, and certainly the delegations that exchanged views around that presidential summit from the corporate and business community was impressive. However, there was also a line of distrust in some Western coverage that perhaps China was egging South Korea on in a way, that perhaps this was almost too successful of a meeting, was one criticism I read. And by that, what they meant was that they were taking advantage, they being Beijing, of anti-Japan sentiments in Korea. I don't, I think people can parse out the arguments the way they want, and we have a very educated audience here in our studio, but do you have thoughts on China's approach to Korea? Is there a new, more pragmatic relationship? Does the Xi Jinping regime seem to be one that is working more closely with Seoul? Mm-hmm. Certainly a lot was made of the fact that the visit was to Seoul and not to Pyongyang first. Mm-hmm. There was the underpinning of denuclearization, as well as talk about economics and the common agenda. And does it show more egalitarianism in the relationship, for want of a better word?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think China is intent on developing a close relationship with South Korea for economic reasons, for political reasons, and for strategic reasons as well. As you have rightly said, President Xi Jinping made a visit to South Korea before he makes visit to Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. And he did it before he makes visit to Tokyo. So that might send a message to both countries, to North Korea and Japan, that China is now taking South Korea much more seriously than before and wants to create a more cooperative partnership with the South. In the joint statement, the two leaders, President Park Geun-hye and President Xi Jinping, emphasized the growing strategic partnership between the two countries. They expressed a firm opposition to the development of nuclear weapons in North Korea and stated that both countries should work together for promoting peace and security in the region and also moving toward the global partnership. South Korea was quite very prudent. The President Park Geun-hye was quite careful, though, in welcoming President Xi Jinping, in a sense that we refrained from expressing overtly the criticism on Japan based on the history issue. China would have wanted to include it in the joint statement, to jointly criticize and condemn Japan's past atrocities and the wrongdoings in the past, but we refrained from doing that. Also, a Chinese leader proposed to invite South Korea into a new regional bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which China is initiating. But South Korea didn't make any commitments to the invitation, and we think that the issue of governance of this Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank should be examined first before we make any substantial decision on this issue. So we try to keep our position in the right way and try to make our commitment based on the substantial issues and not being swayed by the Chinese charm offensive towards South Korea. Of course, President Xi Jinping made a speech in the Seoul National University to the students that Japanese behavior, Japanese atrocities during the Pacific War were really terrible, and both countries, Korea and China, had to go through all these sufferings together, but we could overcome these problems by the cooperation between the two sides. And certainly there was a message that he tried to convey to the Korean public that on the history issue, China and Korea stand on the same side vis-a-vis Japan. But overall, I think that the South Korean government kept a sense of balance in dealing with China, welcoming President Xi Jinping by keeping his right position on the issue and also considering our relationship with the United States and Japan as well.
Very good. Let me ask you one last question before turning to our studio audience, and that is about the issue of academic exchange. The Korea Society, now almost 60 years old, built on the idea of educating Americans on Korea. You, as I mentioned in the opening, spent time in Boston in the early 80s. You just wrapped up with the Woodrow Wilson Center and have spent, an entire 6 months with them, am I right?
Yes.
And do you have thoughts on this latest experience in Washington, what you've seen, your feeling about the back and forth at this level, and maybe what we can do better and what you see going forward in terms of that?
Yes, I think it is very important that we make our great efforts to provide a good opportunities for the young people, the next generation, to understand the importance of our alliance between Korea and the United States, and to let them have the real world opportunities to learn from the lessons and also learn from the current practices. Academic exchanges between students, I think, is the area where we should make more investment into the future so that we can have a growing number of those young leaders in the future who understand each other's different cultures, speak the language, and understand the history and society as well. Korea society has been playing a very important role in promoting this people-to-people exchange and also highlighting the importance of the Korea-U.S. cooperation and partnership in many areas, especially you have the advantage of being located in the global economic center of New York, the world streets and all the economic vitalities of the city, to provide a greater impetus for young people to find their jobs and to have a kind of a on-the-job training in this city, to know about the American economy and to contribute to the strengthening of the economic partnership between the two countries. That I think that more and more young people should have the opportunities to take advantage of this kind of benefits that both countries can offer through the good work of the Korea society.
Dr. Park-jin, thank you very much. Thank you for your comments this morning. We'd like to provide a little time for the audience to meet with you and say hello one-on-one. We'd like to present you with these.
Oh,
and thank you yet again
much.
for a visit and an insightful morning. Thank you so much. Thank you.